My name is Evan Mericle, and I will be presenting an argument regarding the United States interference with foreign relations. The United States of America continuously interferes with foreign countries by providing armament and financial aid. This repeated interference upsets nations and then results in the U.S. receiving violent and nonviolent backlash. The boarding process was a sterile chaos. Overhead announcements bleeding into one another, rules perfectly recited from memory, compliance mistaken for safety. However, nothing about it guaranteed survival. The plane taxied away from its gate on time to begin its usual journey on another approved route through the sky. Inside the cabin, everything was seemingly normal, but compliance does not always mean safety. The seatbelt sign lit up and the engines accelerated for takeoff. Once at altitude, tray tables clicked and air vents were adjusted as the man stared off into the aisle, thinking mindlessly, allowing for utter complacency. He was going home to see his wife and their young kids after being gone for months on deployment. He was caught off guard when people began moving around while progressively raising their voices in conversation. The flight attendants quit working calmly, and the captain did not make an announcement, but the plane deliberately turned away from their path. Soon, the clouds disappeared quickly, and in their place, the city appeared. The buildings grew closer. They were no longer pretty views below them, but instead, they were frightening obstacles in front of them. The buildings were so close, they spanned across individual windows. There was no time for panic, because there was barely time for understanding. This plane is not landing. The sheer speed of the plane did not allow the man or the 86 other passengers on board the opportunity to say goodbye to their loved ones. Instead, the sterile order of the morning was completely shattered into one single violent moment of force. On the street below, the sound arrived well before anyone could comprehend what was happening. A deep impact rolled through the ground, buildings, and bodies. Everyone below was now hyper-focused on the tragic event that occurred right above them. Smoke ripped open the side of a building in a way that did not appear as an accident. Debris began to fall from as high as 110 floors up. People had questions, worries, and injuries. However, before anyone could do anything, a second plane entered the field of view. It was visible long enough to be understood. However, it was fast enough to completely destroy denial. People began running after more debris began to fall. However, everyone was running without direction. In the buildings above where the plane sit, escape was no longer a concept. Instead, it was a difficult calculation. The unbearable heat of the fire made breathing difficult and painful. Direction was engulfed by smoke. Instructions came through the loudspeakers. They were calm but procedural. However, they were simply irrelevant. People tried to call their loved ones, but not one description of what was happening could change the outcome of what was to come. Soon, the ground beneath the hundreds of people trying to escape the inevitable shifted. Waiting was no longer a viable option. It was agonizing. Soon, their choices were quickly shortened: endure what was soon to come, or simply step away from it. The broken glass in front of them reflected faces stripped of hope, but not awareness. The devastation that day was not created overnight, and despite the fact that they were acts of calculated evil, the organizations that carried them out were formed over decades of geopolitical conflict and foreign intervention. To properly understand how these extremist organizations developed the power and resources in order to carry out one of many attacks, it is necessary to dive into America's past foreign relations in Afghanistan. On July 3, 1979, the CIA would unknowingly begin their most expensive operation, Operation Cyclone. Operation Cyclone began when the United States expanded operation into Afghanistan because of rising tensions between the Soviets and the Afghans following the Cold War. The United States began providing resources through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence. Their intentions were to provide armaments and finances to the anti-communist Muslim guerrillas during their conflict with the communist Afghan government. This support was extremely significant in overturning the Soviet-backed Afghan government. However, it indirectly created conditions promoting the formation of Afghanistan-based terrorist groups. A major factor was that the Pakistan government greatly favored and heavily funded Afghan fundamentalist factions that espoused strict Islamic beliefs. Therefore, the United States indirectly assisted with formation of terrorist groups such as the Haqqani Network, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. The Haqqani Network was formed by Jalaluddin Haqqani, a prominent and powerful Mujahideen fighter. The Haqqani Network was designated as a terrorist group by the United States after they carried out some of the deadliest and most complex attacks against the United States-led coalition forces in Afghanistan. The Taliban was formed around the same time, using support from Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, and they quickly gained control by promising to restore order and enforce strict Islamic law. And by 1996, the Taliban gained control of most of Afghanistan and held close ties with a terrorist organization known as Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, formed by Osama bin Laden, used the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan as a safe haven. The aftermath of foreign intervention in Afghanistan shows how intervention can create long-term instability that extends far beyond its original extent. This pattern, however, is not limited to conflict in distant regions. In fact, there are similar concerns in Mexico, where economic dependence, political pressure, and cross-border influence largely shape internal instability. Since Mexico is neighboring the United States, the issue becomes even more sensitive, and where there has to be a balance between sovereignty and assistance. For example, Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum stated in a recent speech, "Cooperation, yes. Subordination and intervention, no." This highlights a key clear issue. The United States can support reform, but once involvement begins to override a nation's independence, it becomes harmful rather than helpful. This information is critical for understanding the rise of cartel power. This information is critical for understanding the rise of cartel power and the socioeconomic conditions that drive figures like Guzman and the socioeconomic effects on upbringing in figures like Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was a prominent figure within cartels. Specifically, he was the former top leader of the Sinaloa cartel. Guzman grew up in the poor, rural community of La Tuna within the region of Sinaloa. His father was a subsistence cattle rancher and began growing opium poppies in order to make ends meet. The nearest school was 60 miles away, which ultimately led to Guzman dropping out of school in the 3rd grade. He was functionally illiterate, however, he automatically felt the need to help support his struggling family. At age 15, he began cultivating his own marijuana plantation. His mother said he always fought for a better life. In his late teens, while seeking better opportunities, Guzman joined the drug trade through an uncle. He was given his first big break when former cartel kingpin Hector Aguero Palma allowed Guzman to oversee a shipment of drugs coming from the Sierra Madre Mountains. Guzman was described as a no-nonsense kind of person in Malcolm Beath's book, The Last Narco, and it is known that he would kill people himself immediately with no remorse. Socioeconomic conditions cannot be effectively changed by armament and financial aid alone. This leads to the necessary questions about how the United States should approach involvement in countries such as Mexico. The early life of Guzman serves as an example of how limited economic opportunity, combined with corruption, can quickly lead to involvement in the drug trade. Sufficient job opportunities barely exist because many people in Mexico grow up where the only available jobs are seasonal farming, cartel work, and informal street labor. Also, the corruption deeply rooted in the cartel's presence discourages businesses from investing, building, and hiring workers. Therefore, new jobs are scarce, just like the wages in the even bigger, more populated cities. With cartel work providing steady pay and security within the region, no jobs come close to even competing with the drug trade. These conditions do not suggest that the United States should completely quit assisting Mexico. Instead, its approach should be limited and carefully planned. Previous examples perfectly demonstrate how direct involvement and control can produce ill, unintended consequences. Instead of mass intervention, the United States should focus on cooperation that supports economic development without strenuous control. For instance, encouraging nearshoring, trade partnerships, and investments, job creation that operate within Mexico's already existing framework can contribute to enduring stability without repeating mistakes on part of the United States. Despite knowing the mistakes the United States has made over recent decades, proponents for foreign intervention still exist. These proponents for intervention argue for a form of control, more specifically, direct control over foreign nations. Several trucks arrived without warning, merely intention. They arrived before dawn, carrying crates of authority. Before the sun could rise, the trucks were unloaded and the crates were stacked neatly in the center of town. People gathered, looking for hope. Soon, people were looking from afar, peeking through cracked doors and windows. They were told that this was the solution, and they believed it. Within just a few days, there were already signs of failure. Supplies intended for protection disappeared. Weapons quietly changed hands without resistance. The ones who already held power did not fight the intervention. They used it. The streets quickly grew quieter, not safer. The presence of external support did not reduce fear, it only concentrated it. What was introduced as order became a tool of control, handed to the people responsible for the structure it was meant to dismantle. And from a distance, their efforts would be labeled as effective. Stability had seemingly been achieved, but reality was utterly undeniable. Nothing had been used as intended. The belief that external control and funding can be used within instability without being consumed by it is the fundamental flaw in interventionist thinking. Advocates of intervention propose that specific economic assistance could change the socioeconomic conditions that drive people like Guzman to fall into cartel recruitment. However, financial aid sent to a nation that has a persistent issue of corruption does not automatically fix any issue. In fact, a surplus of financial abundance in the hands of a system deeply compromised by intimidation, cartel influence, and bribery does not create good job opportunities or dismantle organized crime. Instead, the aid is quickly depleted and used dishonestly before it can reach its intended purpose. For example, in 2025, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction estimated that as little as 30 to 40% of donor funds reached their intended population after the Taliban's and other fees, bribes, and extortion. To further reinforce this, foreign intervention carries significant diplomatic repercussions that weaken the United States' position with its allies. When the United States is repeatedly involved in the internal affairs of foreign countries, it weakens trust. Furthermore, when the United States seek to build a coalition between alliances, the nations at hand take heed. If they fear their sovereignty may be compromised, they may cease to align themselves with the initiatives of the United States. As a result, intervention puts the nations at hand at the risk of increased destabilization while undermining the diplomatic credibility of the United States on a global level. Ultimately, the events of September 11, 2001 continue to stand as one of the most devastating moments in American history. But they were not the consequences of acts of violence created in isolation. Instead, they were the outcome of decades of geopolitical conflict and foreign intervention. It was demonstrated by the United States' involvement in Afghanistan that even well-intentioned aid can produce long-term instability. Al-Qaeda was the product of a system shaped by outside influence and significant internal conflict that quickly led to the misuse of foreign aid. These consequences are equally relevant in other parts of the world, such as Mexico, where instability is influenced by economic hardship, political pressure, and cross-border influence. The upbringing in figures like Guzman demonstrate how limited economic opportunity and corruption create insubstantial job opportunities. These socioeconomic conditions cannot be changed by external force or financial aid alone. Instead, they must be the product of internal reform and economic development supported by stable institutions. Thank you.
I have a question for clarification. I appreciated how you told the narratives to grab our attention about the setting on the plane before the crash in 9/11 and the life of El Chapo. Can you make it a little more clear how U.S. intervention led to the problem of El Chapo Guzman?
So
there may have been a historical part that I missed in the paper.
I had to leave out a lot of information from my presentation document. Foreign intervention did not lead to the upbringing of Guzman.
Right.
However, I use that narrative because I believe that shows the conditions that figures such as Guzman are brought up in, and so I thought that it was important to be able to grasp that, and that people like Guzman are not brought up in great socioeconomic conditions,
right,
and that can ultimately lead to cartel recruitment. And so with that, I am talking about.
So he's recruited by the cartel, but how did U.S. outside intervention in Mexican life cause the future problem that the U.S. had with El Chapo?
It did not.
Okay.
So the U.S. intervention in Mexico did not cause that at all. It's simply talking about how intervention can, people are arguing that foreign intervention from U.S. could help change these conditions that people like Guzman are brought up in.
Okay, thank you.
Evan, in another one of your narratives, the one where you were talking about the trucks arriving without warning, carrying crates of authority, where was that, and who was it, and what was in the crate?
So that is a narrative that I guess it is fictional to some extent, but it is something that is true that happens. Like, for example, there are convoys of trucks going into Gaza to help feed, in their case, it's food and other resources to help feed the starving kids and just soldiers and whoever is hungry, I guess. But that narrative is just to kind of convey the idea that, that happens.
Well, I guess I'm asking for clarification about, it's a great metaphor. I guess I want the metaphor explained. Like, what are you saying is being brought in, and then it goes on to say that it was misused. So maybe can you...
Yes. So with that, I am saying that, there are convoys of trucks of carrying supplies, whether that supplies be weapons or financial aid or just food. It is being brought in, and the civilians are, seeking for hope, and they're looking for that to, get them out of their terrible conditions. But when you put supplies into a nation that can't quite handle the supplies, and the control cannot be guaranteed, then that causes issues, and it can oftentimes make the issues even worse. So that is further breakdown of that.
Thank you.
Yes,
Just
sir.
to confirm what you're saying, in Gaza, you have Hamas, and they were donated all kind of wheat. Well, they would, and it's for the people, but they would go get the wheat, and they would overcharge for it. So they charged 6 times the amount for wheat, and so the people couldn't afford wheat. But it was all donated by foreign countries. So yeah, I think you do a great job. One statement you made, the very last statement actually you made, is a really important statement. The socioeconomic conditions cannot be changed by external force or extensive financial aid alone. Instead, they must be the product of internal reform and economic development supported by stable institutions.
Yes, sir.
I think that's a really insightful comment. So the U.S. has developed systems and aid both in good and bad ways. And they were all packaged into this group called USAID. Do you know anything about USAID?
Do not believe I'm
Okay, it's fine.
familiar with it.
And so it was recently dismantled, and it stopped a lot of the poor aid decisions we were making, which we were making a lot, but it also destroyed a lot of the system building groups that we had that would help other countries develop systems. I guess my question is this, and as you were thinking about these things, what are some of the system economic development and system development that you would suggest for other countries for the U.S. to help with, if just intervention or aid doesn't always help? Yeah.
Well, so I am stating that just the foreign interference alone, that kind of intervention does not help these nations. Instead, it should be done by internal reform and development within the country. So that way it respects the sovereignty and independence of said countries, and it can further strengthen it rather than just interfering.
I guess the question I have is this. In Gaza with Hamas, in Mexico with the cartel being more powerful than the government, it seems like if you just leave it up to those countries themselves to develop their internal systems, it's never going to happen because they've gotten to the point where they are for a reason. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
So, like, how would we potentially change that?
So, for example, Trump recently mentioned sending military to go and combat the cartels in Mexico to help with, the Mexican government fighting the cartels. Well, the Mexico president had a speech that referred to a lot of that and said that they do not want Trump to send military to fight their problems and interfere with their independence and their sovereignty. And so with that, it should instead be formed internally and backed by stable institutions, such as you can consider U.S. a stable institution, and they can help support that reform. But I don't think it should interfere with the sovereignty of Mexico or the other countries.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
It sounds like you're advocating for an isolationist position, like that the U.S. should just keep to its own business and never meddle in any foreign affairs, is what it sounds like you're saying without explicitly saying it. But so I guess one question would be, is that what you're saying? And then if not, are there any circumstances that would be legitimate for the U.S. to play a part in foreign affairs?
So, to answer your first question, I'm not arguing for an isolationist society, nor am I arguing for complete intervention, so to speak. But I'm arguing for, cooperative intervention. So it's not interfering with the sovereignty of foreign countries, by providing armament and financial aid directly. But it is also not the United States keeping to itself, because I believe if that happens, then the neighboring country of Mexico, for example, those problems can just get worse. And they're right next to us, so I feel like it's kind of in our best priority to help them out.
So then, with that said, let's maybe give some guiding principles. Like, what are the things that guide? Because that's a very complex situation, right? I would agree with you that it seems foolish to just say, "Oh, we're just going to keep to our own business," and because we live in a very connected global world that has lots of interconnected problems and issues. So then, because of that, there seems like there has to be some principles that guide how we determine when do we step in and do something and when do we not. I mean, we're currently involved in conflicts, humanitarian aid, all sorts of things all over the world. What are the things that should help guide those decisions?
It's a great question. Honestly, I'm not too sure on what the steps should be taken to discern that. But I don't know that it should be governed by, or those steps should be governed by one person, because that's a lot to think about. And I think that it's subjective to, or relative to what the actual situation is. Like in Mexico, there are problems with drugs coming across the borders. There are problems with United States guns going into Mexico. And like, for example, 70% of the guns recovered in Mexico are from the United States. So that alone it's a striking number. And so with that issue in mind, maybe trying to limit those guns going into Mexico and falling in the hands of cartels, that could be just one way.
It makes me think of just, the issue that Mr. Davis brought up. Even just humanitarian aid in Gaza, that is a really complex and difficult situation. So this will be my last question. Does that mean we don't help? Because people take advantage of that help and organizations kind of usurp that help and use it for their own benefit, does that prohibit us from helping?
Well, I think that we should try to help as much as we can, but I think that it should be used correctly, and I think that we need to try to make sure of that as best as we can. And so, yeah.
Okay, you brought up the guns that are recovered in Mexico, and they are from the United States. I'm going to read you this little portion of your paper, and I want you to explain why it's this way. You have 70% of guns recovered in Mexico are continuously smuggled in from the United States. These same illegally imported guns are arming the cartels and allowing them to overpower the Mexican government. However, it is not just illegal aliens smuggling firearms. In fact, it is actually both Americans and illegal aliens doing it for a little extra cash.
Yeah, so do you just want me to kind of unpack that a little bit?
Yes.
So it's not just illegal immigrants that are smuggling these guns and even drugs across the borders both ways. And it's actually, a lot of it is Americans as well, smuggling it to just get money for just quick cash. And it's a big issue that it seems that a lot of people don't know about.
So does border control prevent that?
So a lot of the border patrol is corrupt, and a lot of people in that area are corrupt, and they'll do it too. And it's a lot of people, and it's hard to, I guess, catch everyone. It's kind of a difficult one to answer because I'm not there and I've not actually witnessed it myself.
Yes, it is all a complex issue, and believe it or not, you don't have time to take any questions from the audience because we are finished. Evan?